If anyone ever finds these words, then listen carefully. Not because I expect you to believe me, but because I was once foolish enough to think the sea only hides storms. My name does not matter anymore. Once I was a sailor aboard the merchant vessel North Star, a square-rigged ship that sailed under the English flag sometime near the end of the 17th century. I was 27 years old when the sea decided it had something to show me. And ever since that voyage, I have never truly slept again. I tried telling people what happened. Fishermen, dockmasters, a priest once, when the nights grew too heavy. They laughed, or worse, they looked at me with the quiet pity reserved for men whose minds have cracked somewhere between land and water. But the truth is simple. Something lives out there. Not storms, not pirates, not reefs waiting beneath black water. Something older, something patient. And I know this because I was the only man who came back. Our voyage began like 100 others before it. The North Star left Bristol Harbor in the late spring of 1683, carrying wool, tools, and barrels of salted pork bound for the colonies. She was a broad-bellied merchant ship with creaking timbers and a crew of 23 men, 24 if you count the cook's boy, 25 if you count me. The captain was a stern man named Alden Briggs, a veteran of 20 years at sea whose beard had turned the color of storm foam. He trusted charts more than prayers and believed every mystery of the ocean would eventually be measured and mapped. He was wrong. For the first weeks, the voyage was calm. The wind filled our sails kindly, and the Atlantic rolled beneath us like a giant breathing creature that had no interest in our little wooden hull. Days passed with the rhythm sailors know well, ropes tightening in the morning air, salt drying on the railings, cards played under lantern light. Nothing strange, nothing yet. It began with a silence, not sudden, not dramatic, just wrong. The first man to notice was Thomas Reed, our lookout, a thin fellow with sharp eyes who could spot sails at impossible distances. One evening near dusk, he climbed down from the crow's nest and said something that made the men laugh. "Sea's too quiet." Someone asked what he meant. Thomas scratched his beard and stared at the water. No birds. That seemed a strange thing to worry about, but he was right. Not a single gull circled above us. No albatross drifting on the wind. No petrels skimming the waves. Just sky, just water, and our ship alone between them. The next morning the silence deepened. Even the sea sounded different. You must understand something about sailors. After long enough at sea, you learn the ocean's voice the way a man learns the breathing of someone sleeping beside him. Waves slap the hull. Wind hums through rigging. Wood groans as it bends. But that morning the ocean sounded muffled, like cloth wrapped around a bell. No one spoke of it openly. Men rarely admit fear when there's work to be done. But I remember the way they moved slower that day. The way conversation stopped halfway through sentences. The cook's boy dropped a bucket and jumped as if something had grabbed his ankle. And that night, we heard the first sound. It came sometime after midnight. I had the late watch with 2 other sailors, Henry Cole and old Matthew Dunn. The moon hung low and pale above the water, painting the ocean in silver. Everything looked calm, too calm. Then Henry froze. "You hear that?" At first I thought it was wind sliding through the rigging. But then it came again, soft, distant, a voice. Not words, just a sound, something like singing. Matthew spat over the rail and muttered that it was nothing but air moving through rock somewhere below the water. But Henry leaned farther over the side of the ship, and the singing grew clearer. It was beautiful. That is the part that still troubles me most, because even now, remembering it, a part of me wants to hear it again. The voice moved slowly beneath the water, drifting around the hull like something curious. It rose, then sank, then rose again. And suddenly, it stopped, just like that. Silence returned. Henry laughed nervously and said we were all fools. But when we turned to walk back across the deck, Matthew Dunn was gone. At first, we assumed he had gone below deck without saying a word, but his lantern was still sitting beside the rail, still burning, and the sea below it was rippling as if something large had just slipped beneath the surface. We searched the ship, every cabin, every barrel hold, every shadow between cargo crates. Matthew Dunn had vanished. No splash, no cry, nothing. Captain Briggs ordered the search to end after an hour. "Man fell overboard," he said flatly, but one thing troubled me. Matthew had been standing 2 steps from me, and sailors do not fall from ships without noise. The next night, we heard the singing again, but this time it was closer. And something else had changed, because when the sound rose from the water, 3 men began walking toward the railing without a word, like sleepwalkers. That was the moment I realized something was terribly wrong with the sea around us, and by the time we understood how wrong, it was already far too late. Because the ocean had started listening to us, and whatever was beneath it had finally noticed our ship. I remember the exact moment the fear began to spread through the ship like rot in damp wood. Until then, men still believed there was an explanation. A loose railing, a man who slipped, perhaps drink, perhaps sleepwalking. But sailors are not fools for long. The sea teaches you quickly when something is wrong, and something was very wrong with the waters around us. Captain Briggs ordered double watches that next night, 2 men at the bow, 2 at the stern, 4 moving the deck with lanterns. No one was to stand near the rail alone. It sounded reasonable when he said it, but reason fades quickly when the dark ocean begins to whisper. The singing returned shortly after midnight, soft at first, so soft it almost blended with the creaking of the mast. But once you noticed it, you could not stop hearing it. The sound came from the water again, not far from the hull, close enough that the waves carried the voice along the planks like fingers sliding across a drum. It wasn't a song with melody, it was something stranger, a drifting sound that rose and fell in uneven tones, as if whoever made it had never truly learned how human music worked. And yet, it was beautiful. That is the most dangerous part of the memory. The sound felt warm, comforting, like someone calling to you across fog. Henry Cole leaned beside me at the railing. "Do you hear words?" he whispered. I shook my head, but he continued staring into the water. "Sounds like someone asking for help." The sea below us was dark, but the moon had risen high enough to scatter pale light across the surface. The waves looked smooth, too smooth, almost oily, and beneath that surface, something moved. At first I thought it was the shadow of the ship drifting across the water, but the shape moved against the current, long, slow, circling the hull. Then another shape appeared beside it, and another. I counted 4 before they vanished beneath the waves again. Henry saw them too. Neither of us spoke, because once you admit something strange is real, it becomes harder to ignore. The singing drifted along the length of the ship, sometimes near the bow, sometimes near the stern, sometimes directly beneath our feet. And wherever the sound moved, the dark shapes followed. After perhaps an hour, the voice changed. That was when the men began to panic, because the sound started to form something like words, broken, incomplete, but unmistakably human. "Hello?" The word floated up from the water like a breath, quiet, fragile, but every man on deck heard it. A lantern slipped from someone's hand and shattered across the planks. Oil spread across the wood like black blood. No one even noticed. Then the voice spoke again. "Help." The sound came from the water just beside the stern. 3 sailors rushed to the railing. They stared down into the sea, as if someone they knew had fallen overboard. One of them gasped, "I see someone." Captain Briggs stormed onto the deck seconds later. Back from the rail, no one moved. The voice spoke again, closer this time. "Please." And suddenly the water beside the ship rippled outward in a slow circle, like something rising. I stepped forward despite myself. Every instinct told me to look. Every instinct told me something was climbing toward us. The moonlight touched the surface of the sea, and for a moment, I thought I saw a hand. Long fingers, pale, too pale, sliding slowly just beneath the water. Then the singing returned, louder, dozens of voices now, not one, not two, but many. And the men at the rail leaned farther forward, as if the sound was pulling them. Captain Briggs grabbed one sailor by the collar and dragged him back. The man fought like someone waking from a dream. "What are you doing?" the captain barked. The sailor blinked. His face looked confused, almost peaceful. "I thought I saw my wife," he whispered. That was when the water exploded upward. Something pale shot from the sea beside the hull, a blur of white and gray. A scream tore across the deck, and one of the sailors vanished over the railing before anyone could grab him. The splash came a second later, then silence. The singing stopped instantly. Captain Briggs slammed his fist against the railing. "Lanterns!" he shouted. "Bring lanterns!" Light spilled across the water as men rushed forward. The ocean looked calm again, perfectly calm, too calm. Then we saw it, floating beside the hull. The sailor who had been taken drifted face down in the water, but something was wrong with the way he moved. His body twisted slowly, as if something beneath him was holding his legs. Then the corpse jerked downward, violently, and vanished into the dark. The water closed over him without a ripple. No one spoke for a long time after that. But sometime before dawn, while the sky was still black and the men stood frozen across the deck, the singing returned once more. Only now, it was right beneath the ship. And there were so many voices that the entire ocean seemed to be breathing. That was the moment Captain Briggs made the worst decision of our voyage. Because instead of turning the ship around, he ordered us to sail forward, straight into the silent waters ahead. And by morning, we saw the island. A place that did not appear on any chart, a jagged shape rising from the mist like broken teeth. At the time we believed it might be salvation, land, fresh water, perhaps even safety. But the sea had already followed us there, and whatever lived beneath those waters was waiting on that island too. By the time the sun rose, none of us had slept. The night had drained every bit of courage from the ship, leaving the crew hollow-eyed and quiet as ghosts. And yet, the island stood before us, a jagged strip of black rock rising from a gray morning fog. No sails on the horizon, no birds circling overhead, just that island, waiting. Captain Briggs stood at the bow with a brass spyglass pressed to his eye. He studied the shoreline for a long time. Then he lowered the glass slowly. "I don't see reefs," he said. "Water's deep enough. We'll anchor." Several men protested immediately. One of them was Henry. "Captain," he said carefully, "after what happened last night, maybe it's wiser we keep moving." Briggs turned his head just enough to look at him. "And sail where?" No one answered. Our charts did not show land anywhere near our position, but the ocean is old, and sailors know maps lie more often than the sea does. Is less than Hashone, 5 hash is greater than... So the North Star dropped anchor just offshore, perhaps 200 yards from the rocky beach. The water near the island was strangely still. No rolling waves, no breaking surf. just slow, heavy swells that lifted the ship like the breathing of some giant creature beneath us. The singing had stopped with the sunrise, but none of us believed it was gone. Captain Briggs ordered a landing party, 6 men, myself included. We lowered the longboat just after noon. As the ropes creaked and the hull touched the water, I felt a coldness settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the wind. The sea around the island looked darker than the open water behind us, almost thick. Henry rowed beside me. Neither of us spoke as the boat slid toward the beach, but halfway there, he whispered something. "Look." I followed his gaze. The water beneath the boat was clear enough to see several feet down, and something moved there, a pale shape, gliding slowly beneath the surface. Then another. Then another. They followed the boat without making a sound. "Don't look down," muttered one of the sailors at the front. "Just row." So we rowed, harder, faster, until the keel scraped against the stones of the beach. The island smelled wrong. That was the first thing I noticed. Not salt, not seaweed, something sharper, like rotting shells left too long in the sun. The beach was narrow and littered with dark rocks, polished smooth by years of water. Beyond it rose a slope of black stone and twisted gray grass that rattled softly in the wind. No trees, no birds, no insects, nothing living that we could see. Captain Briggs stepped onto the shore first. The rest of us followed. For a moment, none of us moved, because the silence here was deeper than anything we had heard at sea. Then Henry crouched near the sand. "Captain." We gathered around him. At first, I thought he was pointing at shells scattered along the shore, but when I looked closer, they were not shells. They were bones, hundreds of them, small, bleached, smooth as if worn by water. Human bones. A cold wind rolled across the beach, and somewhere far behind us, something splashed in the sea. Captain Briggs turned sharply toward the water, but nothing broke the surface, only the quiet rocking of the North Star in the distance. We searched the island for nearly an hour. It was smaller than it first appeared, a ring of jagged cliffs surrounding a shallow interior hollow filled with black stones and stagnant pools. The ground was covered in more bones, not just human, fish, birds, animals we could not name, everything picked clean. But the strangest discovery waited near the center of the island. It was Henry who found it, a long ridge of stone that curved across the ground like the spine of some enormous buried creature. At its base lay something half covered by sand. He brushed the grit away slowly. Then he stepped back. His less than Heshone, 5 hash is greater than. It was a skull, but not shaped like any human skull I had ever seen. The jaw was too long, the teeth too thin and sharp, and along the sides of the bone were narrow slits that looked disturbingly like gills. No one spoke. Then the wind carried a sound across the island. Soft, distant, singing. It came from the sea, but also from somewhere closer, somewhere behind the rocks. Henry turned slowly toward the shoreline. "Captain." I followed his gaze, and far down the beach, standing knee-deep in the water, were figures. 3 of them, pale shapes swaying gently with the tide, too far to see clearly, but unmistakably watching us. The singing grew louder, and as the fog began to roll back from the shore, the truth finally revealed itself. Because the figures stepped forward from the water, and what stood there was neither fish nor woman, but something terrible caught between the two. Their skin shone gray in the sunlight. Their arms were long and thin, ending in webbed fingers. and where their legs should have been, long dark tails moved slowly through the surf. One of them tilted its head and smiled. That was the moment we understood. The voices in the water, the singing in the night, the men pulled overboard. They had not been accidents. We had sailed straight into a hunting ground, and we had just walked onto their shore. For several long seconds, none of us moved. The wind dragged across the stones of the island, carrying the low, trembling sound of that terrible singing. The three creatures stood in the surf, half hidden by drifting foam, watching us. I remember thinking that my mind must be inventing it, that the exhaustion of the voyage had finally cracked something inside my skull. But then one of them stepped farther onto the shore, and the illusion died. Its body moved with a slow, deliberate grace. From the waist upward, it resembled a woman in the most distant and unsettling way. Shoulders narrow, arms long, fingers thin and webbed like the feet of water birds. But the skin was wrong, not the warm tone of living flesh. It was gray, cold gray, and beneath the surface of that skin, something shifted faintly, as if thin lines of darker color moved like veins filled with black water. Its face is the part that still visits me in dreams. The shape was almost human, but the eyes were too wide, the pupils too dark, and the mouth stretched farther across the cheeks than any natural smile should. When it opened those lips slightly, I saw the teeth, thin, needle-like, hundreds of them. One of the sailors behind me whispered a prayer. Another made the sign of the cross. Captain Briggs did neither. He stepped forward. "Hold," he said quietly. The creature tilted its head again, listening. The singing drifted from its throat without its mouth moving, a low humming vibration that seemed to pass through the stones beneath our feet. Then, in a voice that sounded like water sliding through broken glass, it spoke. "Stay." The word was warped, imperfect, but unmistakably human. Behind it, the other two figures swayed slowly in the surf, and beneath the water behind them, more shapes moved, many more. Henry took a slow step backward. "Captain, there are dozens." The sea beyond the shore had begun to ripple, dark forms sliding beneath the surface like shadows drifting across the ocean floor. Captain Briggs raised his pistol, not firing, just holding it. "Back to the boat," he said calmly. No one argued. We began stepping slowly across the rocks toward the beach, every movement careful, every breath shallow. The creatures did not follow immediately. They simply watched, smiling those long, terrible smiles. The longboat sat where we had left it, half grounded against the stones, only 50 yards away. 50 yards might as well have been 50 miles. Halfway there, the singing grew louder, not from the three creatures on the shore, from the water. The ocean began to move, not with waves, but with bodies. Pale shapes broke the surface all along the shoreline. First 5, then 10, then 20. Their heads rose silently above the water, long wet hair clinging to narrow faces. Dozens of eyes stared toward us, and every one of them was smiling. "Move faster," Henry muttered. We reached the boat. 2 men grabbed the sides. Another jumped inside and seized the oars. Then the first scream came. One of the sailors at the back of the group cried out and stumbled forward. Something had seized his ankle. A pale arm stretched from the shallow water beside the rocks, its fingers wrapped around his leg like hooked wires. The man kicked wildly. Another creature rose beside him, its head emerging from the foam. The mouth opened wide, wider than any human jaw could open. The bite came fast, a snap of white teeth. Blood splashed across the stones. The sailor disappeared beneath the water before anyone could grab him. Panic erupted instantly. "Push the boat," Captain Briggs roared. We shoved the longboat into the surf. The hull scraped violently across the rocks before sliding free into the water. Henry and I jumped inside. 2 others followed. Briggs leapt in last, shoving the boat away from shore with the butt of his pistol. "Row." The oars hit the water hard. The boat surged forward, but the sea around us had come alive. Shapes moved beneath the surface on all sides, long, pale bodies gliding through the dark water with terrifying speed. One of them surfaced beside the boat, so close I could see the water running from its hair. Its face rose inches from the hull, eyes wide, curious. Then it began to sing. The sound vibrated through the wood of the boat, through my bones, through my skull. For a moment my hands loosened on the oar. I felt an overwhelming urge to lean closer, to listen, to answer. Then Captain Briggs fired his pistol. The gunshot shattered the spell. The creature shrieked a sharp, wet sound like tearing cloth and vanished beneath the waves. But it was too late. All around us, the water began to boil with movement. Dozens of pale shapes surged toward the boat. Hands clawed at the sides. Nails scraped across the wood. One of the sailors screamed as a webbed hand seized his shoulder and dragged him overboard. The splash was swallowed instantly by the churning sea. "Row," Briggs shouted again. And somehow, we did. The North Star loomed ahead of us like a dark fortress against the gray sky. Men on deck shouted when they saw the chaos in the water. Ropes were thrown. Lanterns swung wildly from the rail. Henry grabbed the rope first. I followed, then the captain. But when I looked back at the boat, 2 more sailors were gone. The longboat drifted empty behind us, and beneath it, the water had turned red. We climbed onto the deck of the North Star, shaking and breathless. But the worst discovery came seconds later. Because when Captain Briggs looked across the ship's deck, his face turned the color of ash. Several sailors stood at the railing, leaning forward, silent, still, listening. From somewhere beneath the hull, the singing had begun again. And now, it was coming from everywhere. When we pulled ourselves over the railing, the deck of the North Star looked wrong. Not damaged, not bloody, just still. 6 sailors stood along the starboard rail, leaning slightly forward as if listening to someone speak below the water. Their bodies were stiff, unmoving, lantern light flickering across their faces. None of them reacted when we climbed aboard. "Get them away from the rail," Captain Briggs shouted. Henry rushed forward first, grabbing one of the men by the shoulder. The sailor turned slowly. His eyes looked distant, peaceful, almost happy. "They're calling," he murmured. Before Henry could answer, the man suddenly climbed onto the railing and jumped. The splash came a second later, then another and another. 3 more men threw themselves into the sea before anyone could stop them. Panic swept across the deck. Lanterns swung wildly as sailors rushed forward, grabbing the remaining men and dragging them back from the edge. But the singing had grown louder, much louder. It vibrated through the hull of the ship like the low hum of distant thunder. The sound did not come from one direction anymore. It surrounded us, below the water, along the sides of the ship, even beneath the keel. Captain Briggs loaded another pistol with shaking hands. "Cut the anchor," he shouted. The order echoed across the deck. 2 men ran toward the heavy rope at the bow. If we could move the ship, Maybe we could escape the creatures gathering around us. But before the blade touched the rope, something slammed into the hull. The entire ship shuddered. Another impact followed, then another. It sounded like dozens of bodies striking the wood beneath the water. "They're ramming us," someone cried. The singing suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. Because a moment later, we heard the first scraping sound. Claws sliding slowly up the hull. Everyone on deck froze. The sound came again, long nails dragging across wood, slowly climbing. Then a wet hand appeared over the railing. The fingers were thin and gray, water dripping from the webbing stretched between them. They curled around the wood. Another hand appeared beside it, then another, and suddenly the creatures began pulling themselves onto the ship. The first one rose over the railing in a single smooth motion, its long tail twisted behind it as it dragged itself across the deck with terrifying strength. For a brief moment it looked almost fragile under the lantern light, thin shoulders, long hair clinging to its face. Then it opened its mouth. The scream that came from its throat was not human. It was sharp, wet, like a blade scraping bone. The creature lunged. Its claws sank into the chest of the nearest sailor before he could even raise his arms. Blood sprayed across the deck. The man collapsed instantly. Then more of them came. Over the rails, over the bow, over the stern, dozens of gray bodies hauling themselves onto the ship. The deck exploded into chaos. Men screamed, steel flashed as sailors drew knives and cutlasses. Lanterns shattered as bodies slammed into them. One creature leapt nearly 10 feet across the deck, landing on a sailor's back and tearing into his throat before he could even cry out. Another slithered across the planks with unnatural speed, its tail whipping behind it like a coiled rope. Captain Briggs fired both pistols. The explosions echoed across the ship. One creature's skull burst apart in a spray of dark liquid, but another was already climbing onto the captain's back. I swung a belaying pin at the thing's head. The wood cracked against bone. It shrieked and fell backward into the darkness between cargo crates. For a moment I thought we might hold them off, but then I saw the water. Beyond the rail, hundreds of pale shapes circled the ship. They were waiting for the men on deck to fall. Henry stabbed one of the creatures through the throat with a knife. It collapsed at his feet, but even dying, its mouth twisted into that same long, terrible smile. "They're endless," he shouted. Another scream tore across the deck. I turned just in time to see Captain Briggs dragged to the railing by two creatures clinging to his arms. He fought like a madman, striking them with the empty pistols, but more hands rose from the water. Dozens of them. They seized him and pulled him overboard. His scream cut off the moment he hit the sea. The deck of the North Star was already covered in blood. Bodies lay scattered across the planks, and still the creatures kept coming. That was when I realized something terrible. The ship had begun to move. Not under sail, the wind had died completely. But the North Star was drifting, slowly, silently, being pulled, drawn away from the island, into the black water beyond. And whatever waited out there was far worse than the creatures tearing the crew apart. By the time I understood the ship was moving, half the crew was already dead. The deck of the North Star had turned into a slaughterhouse. Lanterns lay shattered across the planks. their flames dying in oily pools, while bodies sprawled between ropes and cargo crates. And still the creatures crawled across the deck. Some dragged wounded sailors toward the railing. Others tore at the fallen with quick, jerking bites. Their gray bodies moved with unnatural speed, tails whipping across the boards as they hunted. Henry grabbed my arm and dragged me behind a stack of barrels. "We can't fight them all," he said, breathing hard. He was right. Even as we spoke, more pale hands rose over the rail. More heads appeared from the black water below. The ship lurched again, not violently, just a slow, steady pull. I staggered to the edge of the deck and looked over the side. The sea was filled with them, dozens, perhaps hundreds. Their bodies moved through the water in long spirals, pushing against the hull as they swam. But they were not the ones pulling the ship. Something larger moved beneath them. At first I saw only darkness far below the surface, a massive shadow drifting beneath the keel, slow, patient. Then the water shifted, and the shadow moved. My stomach turned to ice. Whatever swam beneath us was larger than the ship itself. The ocean bulged slightly upward as it passed under the hull, pushing the North Star gently to one side. For a moment I saw a pale ridge beneath the water, something like a spine, rows of jagged shapes running along it like the teeth of a saw. Then it disappeared again into the depths. Henry followed my gaze, his face drained of color. "What in God's name is that?" I didn't answer, because the singing had begun again. But now I understood something terrible. The creatures attacking the ship were not singing for us. They were singing for it. The sound rose from dozens of throats at once, vibrating through the water in long, low waves. A call, a signal. The massive shadow below the ship began to rise. Wood groaned beneath our feet as the ocean swelled upward. Then something struck the hull from below. Not a ram, not a crash, just a slow, rising pressure. The ship lifted slightly out of the water, then settled again. Another impact followed, stronger. The keel cracked with a sharp, splintering sound that echoed through the entire vessel. "They're breaking the ship," Henry whispered. All around us, the creatures began retreating toward the rails, not fleeing, simply moving aside, as if their task was complete. Another enormous shape passed beneath the hull. This time I saw it clearly. A vast pale body sliding through the black water, not smooth like a whale, not scaled like a fish. The skin looked rough, ancient, marked by long scars and ridges. And along its back moved dozens of smaller figures, the gray creatures, clinging to it, riding it. Henry stared in horror. "They serve it," he said. The truth struck me all at once. The singing, the hunting, the island filled with bones. Those creatures were not the masters of this place. They were only the hunters, the feeders. The real thing lived below. The sea suddenly erupted. The massive creature surged upward beneath the ship. Wood exploded apart as the keel split open from below. The deck tilted violently. Sailors and bodies slid across the planks as the North Star tore apart. Water flooded the lower deck in seconds. Barrels and cargo crashed through broken railings. Henry grabbed my arm. "We have to jump." But the water below was alive with pale bodies. I saw one last thing before the ship finally broke in two. The creature beneath the water opened its mouth. A vast dark circle larger than the hull of the ship, rows upon rows of long white teeth curved inward like the bars of a cage. The North Star slid toward it. The ship vanished beneath the water with a sound like thunder. The ocean swallowed everything. Henry's hand slipped from mine. I never saw him again. The last thing I remember before the darkness took me was the singing, soft, satisfied, drifting across the water. I do not remember the moment the ship finally disappeared. One moment the world was splintering wood, screaming men, and black water rushing upward. The next moment, there was only cold, endless cold. The ocean closed over my head and swallowed every sound. For a few seconds I kicked wildly, choking on salt water and darkness. Something brushed my leg beneath the surface, and the terror of it nearly stopped my heart. But then the current dragged me away from the wreck, away from the feeding. I surfaced, gasping, coughing seawater into the night air. The sky above me was empty. No moon, no stars, only the distant shapes of waves rising and falling like slow black hills. The North Star was gone. No lanterns, no masts, no cries from the crew. Just drifting wreckage, broken boards, a floating crate, a torn sail. And the singing. It echoed softly across the water, not loud now, not hunting, just satisfied. I forced myself to grab hold of a broken plank drifting beside me, my arms wrapped around the splintered wood while the ocean carried me slowly away from the place where the ship had vanished. Several times I thought I felt something brush past beneath my feet, long shapes moving through the dark water, circling, watching. But none of them touched me. That is something I still cannot explain. Out of 25 men, I, alone, was left alive, and whatever lived in those waters allowed me to drift away. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time does strange things when you float in the middle of the ocean with nothing but darkness around you. Eventually, the singing faded. The sea grew quiet again. Just waves, just wind, just the endless breathing of the water. I must have lost consciousness sometime before dawn, because when I opened my eyes again, I was lying on sand. The morning sun burned against my face as gulls cried somewhere above me. For a moment I thought the entire voyage had been a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. Then I tried to stand and saw the ocean. Wreckage from the North Star littered the shoreline, broken planks, pieces of mast, shattered barrels. No bodies. Not a single one. The beach stretched empty in both directions, a quiet stretch of pale sand beneath a gray sky. I later learned it was the coast of Ireland where the tide had carried me. Fishermen found me sometime near noon. They asked what had happened to the ship, where the crew had gone, why I was alone. And I told them about the singing in the water, about the pale shapes circling the hull, about the island filled with bones, and the creatures that climbed aboard the ship. At first they laughed. Then they stopped laughing when they saw the terror on my face. A priest listened to my story that evening. He said the sea sometimes drives men mad, that loneliness and fear can twist the mind until it invents monsters in the dark. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the ocean truly did steal my sanity somewhere between Bristol and that nameless island. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows in from the sea, I hear something. A sound carried across the water, soft, distant, singing. And once, many years after that voyage, I returned to the shore where the fishermen found me. The tide was low that night. The sea stretched calm and black beneath the moon. I stood there listening to the waves for a long time, trying to convince myself that everything I remembered was only a nightmare. Then something moved in the water, just beyond the breakers. A pale shape rose slowly above the surface. For a moment I saw a face watching me from the dark water, wide eyes, a long, thin smile. Then it sank again without a sound. And from somewhere far out at sea, the singing began. Soft, patient, waiting. Because the ocean is very large, and there are places on its surface where the water listens. And if a ship sails too close to those waters, the singing will begin again. I thought I was going to find endless riches, ancient gold, forgotten knowledge, the kind of discovery that rewrites history books. Instead, I found something that never lets me sleep for long. Every night, when the room goes quiet and the air feels heavy, I hear it again, not clearly, just enough to remember. A wet sound somewhere in the dark, something moving slowly over stone, and the feeling that far beneath the ocean, in a place the sun has never touched, something still remembers that I was there. My name is Adrian Hale, and 10 months ago, I stepped into a place that should have remained buried under centuries of silence. This is the story of how I almost found Atlantis. I wasn't always the kind of man who chased legends. At least, that's what I used to tell people. But the truth is that some obsessions don't begin suddenly. They grow quietly, like roots beneath the ground, until one day you realize your entire life has been built around them. For me, that obsession began when I was 14. My father had been a cartographer for oceanographic surveys. He wasn't famous, and he didn't discover anything remarkable during his career, but he loved maps in a way most people love music or poetry. Our house was full of them, old sea charts pinned to the walls, shelves filled with weathered atlases, notebooks where he sketched coastlines that had been measured 1,000 times before. One evening, while a storm rattled the windows, he showed me something I never forgot. It was an ancient map reproduction, not accurate, not scientific, just a medieval drawing of the Atlantic Ocean, and in the middle of that empty blue expanse, someone had painted a city, tall towers, circular walls, bridges crossing wide canals. Above it, written in faded ink, was a single word: Atlantis. My father laughed when he saw how long I stared at it. "Most people grow out of that one," he said. I never did. Years later, I studied marine archaeology. I learned how to read sediment patterns, how to analyze sonar imaging, how to recognize when a formation on the ocean floor was natural and when it wasn't. Most of my professors believed the Atlantis legend was philosophical fiction, but sometimes, during deep-sea scans, strange structures appeared where there shouldn't have been any. Symmetrical shapes, perfect lines, things nature rarely creates. Those anomalies were always dismissed. Instrument error, geological coincidence, wishful thinking. But every time I saw one, the same thought crept back into my mind. What if something really was down there? For nearly 7 years I followed that question. 7 years of studying obscure records, translating fragments of ancient travel logs, chasing rumors that led nowhere. Until one night, buried inside a digital archive of expedition reports, I stumbled across a name that changed everything. Professor Leonard Calloway. 10 years earlier, Calloway had led a deep ocean survey somewhere in the Atlantic basin. The official purpose of the expedition had been geological mapping, but something strange had happened afterward. He published exactly one short paper from that mission, and then vanished from the academic world completely. No interviews, no lectures, no explanations, just silence. That alone wouldn't have meant much. Researchers disappear from the spotlight all the time, but buried in the appendix of his final report, there was a single photograph that caught my attention. The picture showed a thin metal plate resting on a table aboard their research vessel. Its surface was covered in symbols carved with incredible precision, symbols that didn't belong to any language I recognized. Below the photograph, Calloway had written a short caption, just one sentence: "Recovered from submerged cavern. Origin unknown." And beneath that, a handwritten note, "Not yet understood." Something about those words bothered me. Researchers usually don't leave mysteries behind like that, not without trying to solve them, unless they couldn't, or unless what they found scared them enough to walk away. It took me almost 3 months to track him down. Calloway hadn't vanished completely. He had simply retreated. He was living in a small coastal town in Maine, in a weather-beaten house overlooking a gray stretch of ocean that looked cold even in summer. I remember standing outside his front gate with the wind pulling at my coat, wondering if I should just turn around and go home. But curiosity has a way of pushing you forward, even when some quiet part of your mind is telling you not to. So I knocked on the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard slow footsteps inside. The door creaked open, and standing there was a tall, thin man in his 70s, with sharp gray eyes that looked like they had spent a lifetime studying things no one else could see. "Professor Calloway?" I asked. He looked at me carefully, not annoyed, not surprised, just cautious. "Yes," he said slowly. The wind carried the smell of salt between us. I hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "My name is Adrian Hale," I told him. "I think you found something 10 years ago." For a second, I thought he might close the door. Instead, something changed in his expression. Not fear, something closer to recognition, as if he had been waiting a very long time for someone to say those words. "Come inside," he said quietly, "because if you're here about that, then we need to talk." That conversation lasted almost 6 hours, and by the time it was over, my life had already started moving toward the place where the nightmares began. Calloway's house smelled faintly of old paper, sea salt, and something metallic I couldn't quite place. The kind of smell you notice in laboratories where strange things have been sitting undisturbed for too long. He led me into a study overlooking the ocean. The room was dim, lit only by a brass desk lamp and the pale gray light leaking through the curtains. Maps covered nearly every wall. Some were modern satellite charts. Others looked centuries old, edges curled and stained. But what caught my attention immediately were the notebooks. Stacks of them, dozens, maybe more, each one filled with careful handwriting. Calloway noticed where I was looking. "I tried," he said quietly, lowering himself into a chair. "For 10 years I tried." He studied my face for a moment before continuing. "You said you think I found something," he said. "Tell me what you know." I reached into my bag and pulled out a printed photograph. The metal plate, the one from his expedition report. He stared at it for a long time. Then he leaned back and let out a slow breath that sounded almost tired. "So it finally surfaced again," he murmured. I told him everything, about the archive, about the symbols, about how none of the languages matched. I told him about the strange pattern hidden in the numbers scratched along the edge of the plate, and when I explained the coordinate grid I had started mapping across the Atlantic, Calloway's expression changed. Not disbelief, recognition. "You're further than I was," he said quietly. That sentence sent a chill down my spine. "You mean you never decoded it?" I asked. He shook his head. "No," he replied. "I tried every linguistic structure I knew. Ancient Mediterranean alphabets, Proto-Semitic scripts, even symbolic geometry systems." He gestured toward the stacks of notebooks. 10 years of work. His voice softened. And still nothing. For a while, neither of us spoke. Outside, waves rolled slowly against the rocky shore below the house. Then he stood up and walked to a tall cabinet near the wall. From inside, he removed something wrapped in dark cloth. When he placed it on the desk between us and unfolded the fabric, I finally saw the object in person, the metal plate. Up close, it was even stranger than the photograph suggested. The surface wasn't corroded the way most submerged artifacts would be. The metal looked almost untouched by time, and the symbols They were precise in a way that made my eyes uncomfortable if I stared too long. Perfect curves, exact angles, not decorative, intentional. Calloway watched my reaction carefully. "You see it too," he said. "What?" I asked. "The structure," he replied. I leaned closer. At first it looked like a random spiral of markings, but after a moment, something shifted in my mind. The symbols weren't just arranged in lines. They formed paths, intersections, a pattern that repeated across the surface like a map folded in on itself. "That's what bothered me," I said slowly. Calloway nodded. "Exactly." He reached for one of his notebooks and flipped through several pages until he found a hand-drawn diagram, a grid. Across the Atlantic Ocean, tiny circles marking specific points. "You found this pattern in the coordinates, didn't you?" he asked. I felt my pulse quicken. "Yes." He tapped the center of the grid. "The plate doesn't point to one location," he said. "It points to many." I frowned. That doesn't make sense. Why would a map send you to multiple places? Calloway's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the endless gray water beyond the cliffs. "Because it isn't a map," he said quietly. "It's a key." The next 2 hours were some of the most intense intellectual work I've ever experienced. We spread papers across the entire desk, satellite charts, symbol sketches, coordinate overlays. Calloway had already solved half the puzzle without realizing it. He had identified repeating clusters in the symbols, but assumed they were words. They weren't. They were angles. When we rotated sections of the plate and aligned them with the coordinate grid, something extraordinary appeared. The points formed lines. Those lines formed a shape, a massive geometric figure hidden across hundreds of miles of ocean, and at the very center of that shape, one location. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I whispered the only thought in my mind. "That can't be coincidence." Calloway nodded slowly. "No," he said. "It can't." He turned the map toward me. The central point sat in a deep region of the Atlantic where the seafloor dropped into a jagged series of trenches and underwater ridges, a place very few expeditions had explored in detail. I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. "If this is right," I said quietly, "then the plate is guiding us to something hidden there." Calloway's eyes darkened slightly. "Yes." I hesitated. "You've been trying to solve this for 10 years, I said. "Why didn't you go back and investigate?" For the first time since I arrived, the old man looked uncertain. He walked to the window and stared at the ocean for a long moment before answering. "When we found that plate," he said slowly, "we weren't alone in that cavern." I felt the room grow colder. "What do you mean?" He rubbed his hands together as if remembering something unpleasant. "There were sounds," he said, "deep in the rock. Movements where there shouldn't have been any." He shook his head slightly. "Nothing we could prove. But my team, they didn't want to go deeper." "And you?" I asked. He gave a small, tired smile. "I wanted to," he said, "but something about that place felt wrong, like the cave itself was warning us." He returned to the desk. "And yet," he added quietly, tapping the center of the map, "I never stopped thinking about what might be waiting there." I looked down at the coordinates again. For most researchers, the next step would have been obvious. Publish the discovery. Let a university or institution fund a proper expedition. But both of us understood the problem immediately. If word got out, the location would be flooded with treasure hunters, private salvagers, and media attention before any real research could begin. And if the legend was even partially true, the place we were looking at might contain something the world had never seen before. Calloway folded his arms. "I'm too old to lead an expedition alone," he said. Then he looked at me carefully. "But you're not." I felt the weight of his words settle in the room. "You're suggesting we go there ourselves?" I asked. "Not alone," he replied. "We'd need a small team." His voice grew steadier as the idea formed. "People we trust. Specialists who won't panic the moment things become complicated." He began counting quietly on his fingers. "A cave navigation expert. Someone experienced with deep rock systems. A technical diver. A geologist. And someone who understands ancient languages. I raised an eyebrow. You already have one of those, I said. Calloway smiled faintly. Yes, he said, and now I have another. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small weathered notebook. Inside were several names, 5 to be exact. One of them would change my life in ways I never expected. Her name was Elena Torres, and at that moment, I had no idea that months later, in the darkest place I had ever seen, she would be the only reason I was still breathing. Looking back now, that was the moment the path truly began, a simple decision made in a quiet house above the sea. But if I had understood where those coordinates were leading us, if I had known what waited beneath the rock and water at the end of that journey, I would have walked out of that house. I would have burned the map, and I would have spent the rest of my life pretending Atlantis had never existed. But I didn't, and 3 months later, our expedition began. 3 months later, I was standing on the deck of a research vessel watching the Atlantic stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Gray water, cold wind, the kind of quiet that makes you feel very small. The ship was called the North Star. It wasn't large by scientific standards, but it had everything we needed: sonar equipment, diving rigs, reinforced storage compartments, and a crew that didn't ask many questions as long as they were paid well. Calloway insisted on keeping the true purpose of the expedition quiet. Officially, we were conducting a geological survey of deep coastal cave systems. Unofficially, we were chasing a legend buried beneath miles of stone and ocean. By the time the ship left port, our team of 6 had finally come together. Calloway introduced everyone on the first night in the small briefing room below deck. I remember that moment very clearly now, because back then, we were still strangers. And strangers don't realize how much they will eventually matter to each other. The first was Marcus Reed. Marcus was a cave navigation specialist from Oregon, mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent most of his life squeezing through underground spaces that other people would refuse to enter. He had mapped cave systems in Mexico, Iceland, and once spent nearly 3 weeks exploring an unmapped tunnel network in the Andes. Marcus shook my hand with a firm grip. "If there's a way through rock," he said with a grin, "I'll find it." He said it like a joke. Later, I would remember those words differently. Next came Victor Shaw. Victor was our geologist, tall, thin, with sharp features and the constant expression of someone who was thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. He had worked for several major mining operations before switching to academic research. According to Calloway, Victor could identify the age and formation history of a rock wall faster than most people could read a paragraph. But there was something else about him too. Ambition, the kind that flickers quietly in a person's eyes. Victor didn't just want to study history. He wanted to be remembered for discovering it. The third member of the team was Jonah Briggs. Jonah was our diver, short, muscular, with dark hair and a beard that always looked slightly unkempt no matter how often he trimmed it. He had spent nearly 15 years working on underwater recovery missions, sunken ships, crashed aircraft, even lost cargo containers. Unlike Victor, Jonah didn't care about fame. He cared about survival. "You want to rule?" he told us during introductions. "If the cave starts breathing weird, we leave." Marcus laughed, but Jonah didn't. And then there was Elena Torres. I didn't expect the moment to affect me the way it did. She walked into the room carrying a small leather notebook and a flashlight clipped to her belt. Dark hair pulled back into a loose braid. Calm brown eyes that seemed to study everything around her before she spoke. Calloway introduced her as a linguistic historian specializing in ancient Mediterranean scripts. She had worked on translation projects involving Phoenician trade tablets and several early Greek maritime records. In other words, if the symbols on the metal plate belonged to any ancient language family, Elena was the one most likely to recognize it. When she shook my hand, her grip was confident. "So you're Adrian," she said. "I've read your paper on submerged coastal structures near the Azores." I blinked in surprise. "You've actually read that?" She smiled slightly. Of course, there was warmth in that smile, but also curiosity. as if she was already trying to figure out what kind of person I was. And finally, there was Professor Calloway himself. Even among experienced researchers, he carried an air of quiet authority. But over the weeks that followed, I began to notice something else. Whenever the conversation turned to the metal plate or the coordinates we were chasing, he grew quieter, thoughtful, like someone remembering something unpleasant but choosing not to speak about it. The voyage itself took nearly 8 days. At first, the atmosphere on board was relaxed. Marcus told ridiculous stories about getting lost inside flooded caves in Thailand. Jonah complained constantly about the ship's coffee. Victor spent long hours analyzing sonar readings and muttering calculations under his breath. And Elena, she spent most evenings sitting near the railing with the metal plate resting on a small table between us, studying it. Sometimes I joined her. The ocean would stretch dark and endless beyond the ship while the two of us compared notes under the dim glow of a deck lamp. "You know something strange?" she said one night. "The symbols don't behave like a normal written language." "How so?" I asked. She traced one of the curved lines with her finger. "Languages usually evolve over time. Shapes become simpler, efficient." She looked up at me. "These symbols aren't simplified. They're precise." I thought about the way they formed geometric paths across the plate. "Almost mathematical," I said. Elena nodded slowly. "Yes." Then she added something that made the back of my neck prickle. "It's like whoever carved them wasn't trying to write words." She paused. "It feels like they were trying to lock something away." For a moment, we both listened to the waves hitting the hull of the ship. Then Marcus appeared behind us, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You two still staring at that thing?" he said. "Careful. Another week, and you'll start seeing secret messages in your cereal." Elena laughed softly, and for a moment, the tension faded. But that night, as I lay in my cabin listening to the creaking of the ship, I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. Lock something away. 4 days later, the sonar equipment began detecting something unusual beneath the ocean floor. A hollow structure, deep, buried beneath layers of rock. Jonah leaned over the console, studying the readings. "Well," he muttered, "that's not normal." The scans showed a massive cavern system extending beneath an underwater ridge that rose steeply toward the surface. And near the base of that ridge, a narrow opening, a cave mouth hidden just below the waterline. Marcus whistled quietly. "Well, Professor," he said, "looks like your mystery plate knew where it was sending us." Calloway didn't smile. He simply stared at the screen, and after a long moment he said something that none of us understood at the time. 10 years, he murmured. 10 years, and it's still waiting. We anchored the ship 2 miles from the ridge. The plan was simple. Jonah and Marcus would guide the first dive into the cave entrance, while the rest of us monitored from above. If the tunnel extended upward as the sonar suggested, we would eventually reach dry chambers deeper inside the rock. From there, we would continue on foot. That evening, the sky turned a deep red as the sun sank behind the horizon. The ocean grew strangely calm, almost too calm. I stood near the railing watching the dark water below, and for a moment, I had the strange feeling that something far beneath the surface was watching the ship, waiting. Elena stepped beside me. "You look worried," she said. "Just thinking," I replied. "About what?" I hesitated. Then I said the first thing that came to mind, about how many explorers probably stood somewhere like this before discovering something they couldn't take back. She considered that for a moment. Then she gave a quiet smile. "Well," she said, "let's hope we're smarter than they were." The next morning, we entered the cave, and that was the first step into the place where everything began to go wrong. The morning we entered the cave, the ocean looked almost peaceful. The water was flat, gray, and quiet, like a sheet of metal stretching toward the horizon. Jonah said that was the kind of calm that made him nervous. "Water usually moves," he muttered while checking the pressure seals on his diving gear. "When it sits this still, it means something's changing." Marcus laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "Relax, Briggs. Worst thing we'll find in there is a tight squeeze and some bats." Jonah didn't laugh. The cave entrance sat just below the waterline at the base of the ridge. From above, it looked like nothing more than a dark crack in the rock wall where waves slipped in and out like slow breaths. But sonar had already confirmed something strange. The tunnel sloped upward inside the ridge, which meant somewhere beyond the submerged passage, there were dry chambers. Marcus and Jonah went in first, two black silhouettes slipping into the water, their diving lights cutting pale beams through the darkness. For a long moment the surface swallowed them completely. Then their lights flickered far below the surface and began drifting slowly toward the cave mouth. We waited on deck. Calloway stood beside the sonar console with his arms folded. Victor paced in small, restless circles, glancing at the monitors every few seconds. Elena sat quietly near the railing, her notebook resting on her knees. I noticed she wasn't writing. She was staring at the water. "Something wrong?" I asked. She shook her head. "Just thinking about the symbols," she said. Her eyes drifted toward the cliff wall. "You ever get the feeling that some places aren't meant to be discovered?" I smiled faintly. "That's a strange thing for an explorer to say." "Maybe," she replied softly, "but curiosity doesn't always mean safety." Before I could answer, the radio crackled. Jonah's voice came through the speaker. "We're inside." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Tunnel slopes up just like the scans showed," he continued. "About 30 meters ahead, we've got an air pocket chamber." Marcus's voice joined in. "And you're gonna want to see this." Within 20 minutes, the rest of us were preparing to enter. I had done underwater work before, but something about that cave made my hands move slower than usual while I secured my gear. Maybe it was the darkness beyond the opening. Maybe it was the way the waves sounded when they slipped inside the rock, like distant breathing. Or maybe some part of my mind already understood that crossing that threshold meant leaving the normal world behind. The water was colder than I expected. As soon as I submerged, the chill wrapped around my suit like invisible fingers. Jonah's light beam floated ahead, guiding us through the submerged tunnel. The rock walls were narrow at first, forcing us to move in single file. Marcus led the way. I followed Elena. Behind me came Victor and Calloway. Our lights cut pale tunnels through the dark water as we swam deeper into the ridge. For nearly 2 minutes we moved silently through the submerged passage. Then, suddenly, the tunnel began to rise. The water line appeared above us, and one by one, we emerged into a chamber hidden inside the rock. Marcus climbed onto a ledge first and helped the rest of us out of the water. The cavern was enormous. Our flashlight beams stretched upward across jagged walls that vanished into darkness 30 or 40 feet above us. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, echoing through the space with a slow, hollow rhythm. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Victor whispered the thought all of us were already feeling. "Well," he said quietly, "that's not natural." He was right. The chamber walls were too smooth in places, too symmetrical, not carved by water alone, but shaped. Marcus walked along one side of the cavern, shining his light across the stone. "Look at this," he called. We gathered around. At first I thought the surface was simply worn by erosion, but when my eyes adjusted, I realized the grooves weren't random. They formed lines, symbols. Is less than carved into the rock, is greater than. Elena stepped closer, her light trembling slightly in her hand. "Those are the same markings," she said quietly. "The ones on the plate." Victor ran his fingers along one of the grooves. "They're old," he said. "Very old." Calloway stood silently behind us, staring at the wall as if he had seen it before in a dream. 10 years, he murmured again. "I knew it." Marcus grinned. "Well, Professor, looks like you were right to come back." But Jonah wasn't smiling. He was staring into a narrow passage that opened at the far end of the cavern, a tunnel sloping deeper into the rock. "You hear that?" he asked. We all listened. At first there was only the sound of dripping water. Then something else. A faint whisper of air moving through stone, like wind passing through a long buried hallway. Marcus shrugged. "Caves breathe sometimes," he said. "Pressure differences between chambers." Jonah didn't look convinced. "Maybe," he muttered, but he kept staring into the tunnel. We spent nearly an hour documenting the chamber. Victor collected small rock samples. Elena sketched the symbols into her notebook. I photographed every section of the wall we could reach, and the deeper we looked, the stranger the carvings became. Some showed geometric spirals like the ones on the metal plate. Others looked almost like figures, tall shapes with long limbs and curved backs. At first I thought they were stylized humans. Then I noticed something disturbing. The figures weren't standing. They were hunched, crouched low to the ground, and their mouths were drawn much too wide. Elena noticed it too. "These aren't people," she whispered. Victor frowned. "Maybe ceremonial imagery," he suggested. Primitive cultures often exaggerate features in ritual art, but Elena slowly shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "Look closer." She pointed her light at one of the figures carved into the stone. The shape's arms were wrapped around another smaller figure, and the smaller figure was being pulled toward that wide, carved mouth. Marcus let out a low whistle. "Well, that's cheerful." Jonas stepped back from the wall. "I don't like that," he said. "Not one bit." Calloway finally spoke. "Keep moving," he said quietly. "We didn't come all this way to stop in the first chamber." His voice was steady, but there was something behind it now, something like urgency, or maybe fear. The tunnel beyond the chamber sloped downward. At first it was wide enough for us to walk comfortably, but as we continued deeper into the rock, the air grew colder, and the carvings became more frequent. Entire sections of wall were covered with them. Cities, circles, strange towering structures rising above stylized waves, and everywhere, the same hunched figures. More of them now, dozens, hundreds, watching. After nearly 40 minutes of walking, Marcus suddenly stopped. "Okay," he said slowly. "You guys are gonna want to see this." Our lights moved past him and illuminated the passage ahead. The tunnel ended at the edge of something vast, a massive vertical shaft dropping deep into the darkness, so deep that our flashlights barely touched the bottom, but far below, faint reflections shimmered. Not water, something else, something metallic. Victor leaned forward carefully. "Gold," he whispered. The word echoed faintly down the shaft. "Gold." Marcus turned toward us with a grin. "Well," he said, "looks like we found the door." And none of us understood yet that what we were really looking at was the entrance to the place where the world had buried Atlantis. For a long moment, none of us moved. We just stood at the edge of that enormous shaft, staring down into the darkness. Our lights barely reached the bottom, but what they touched shimmered. Not stone, not water, metal. Marcus slowly crouched near the edge and tossed a small rock into the shaft. We waited. 1 second, 2, 3, then, far below, the faint sound of the stone striking something echoed up the hollow column of rock. A long way down, Victor let out a quiet breath. "That drop has to be at least 80, maybe 100 meters. Jonah crossed his arms. "And the bottom's not water," he said. Victor nodded slowly. "No," his voice lowered slightly. "It's something else." Marcus leaned farther over the edge, sweeping his flashlight down the walls of the shaft. "They carved this," he said. He was right. The rock wasn't rough like the rest of the cave. It had been shaped into massive spiral grooves, forming a descending ramp that wound around the inside of the shaft like the thread of a giant screw. A path downward, deliberate, ancient. Calloway stepped closer to the edge. For the first time since the expedition began, there was something like wonder in his voice. "This isn't just a cave," he whispered. "This is architecture." Elena nodded slowly beside him. "Whoever built this," she said, "expected people to come down here." Victor gave a quiet, satisfied smile. "Then let's not disappoint them." Marcus secured a rope anchor just in case, though the ramp itself looked stable enough to walk. The descent took nearly 20 minutes, and the deeper we went, the stranger the air became. Colder, heavier. There was a faint mineral smell mixed with something older, something like damp metal and dust that had not been disturbed for centuries. Our footsteps echoed along the spiral ramp as we circled downward through the shaft. At one point, Jonah stopped and looked up. The opening at the top had shrunk to a distant gray circle of light. "Feels like we're walking into the throat of something," he muttered. No one laughed that time. Halfway down the ramp, we began seeing more carvings, but these weren't the same as the ones above. They were larger, more detailed. Scenes stretched across the walls in enormous panels of stone. Elena walked slowly beside them, her light tracing each line. "This looks like a story," she said. Victor frowned. "What kind of story?" She pointed to the first carving. It showed a vast city surrounded by water, tall towers, bridges over canals, ships sailing into circular harbors. Marcus smiled. "Well, that part looks familiar. Atlantis." But the next panel was different. The same city, but now the towers were surrounded by something else. Shapes rising from the sea. Not ships, not waves. Figures, hundreds of them, tall and twisted, climbing the outer walls of the city. Victor studied the carving carefully. "Invaders?" he suggested. Elena shook her head slowly. "I'm not sure." The third carving made the silence heavier. The city's people were gathered in a large circle. At the center stood several figures wearing long robes. Their arms were raised toward the sky, and beneath them, something had been carved into the stone floor, a massive symbol. The same spiral pattern we had seen on the metal plate. Elena traced it carefully with her light. "A ritual," she whispered. Calloway's face had grown pale. "Protection," he said quietly. The next carving showed the ocean around the city turning dark, waves rising high around the walls, ships breaking apart. The twisted shapes from earlier now pressed against the waterline, clawing toward the city. And then, the final panel, the robed figures standing again inside the spiral symbol. But this time, their bodies looked wrong. Their arms had grown longer, their backs bent forward, and their mouths were carved open in long, unnatural shapes. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Marcus cleared his throat. "Well," he said quietly, "that's definitely not part of the tourist brochure." Jonah stepped away from the wall. "Let's keep moving." His voice sounded tighter than before. Another 10 minutes later, the ramp finally reached the bottom of the shaft, and that was when we saw it clearly. The reflections we had noticed from above, they weren't random metal. They were structures, buildings, an entire city stretching across a massive cavern beneath the ocean. Atlantis. At least, that's what we thought at the time. Our lights swept across wide stone streets lined with towering pillars, domes made from gold-colored metal, statues taller than houses. The entire place glowed faintly in our beams like something pulled out of a dream. Victor let out a breathless laugh. "Good God," Marcus whistled. "Well, guess we found your treasure." Even Jonah looked stunned. "Never seen anything like this," he murmured. Elena stepped forward slowly, her eyes wide as she studied the architecture. "This place," she whispered, "it shouldn't exist." Calloway said nothing. He simply stood at the edge of the ramp, staring at the silent city below as if trying to understand something that had haunted him for 10 years. We descended the last section of the ramp and stepped onto the stone streets. Dust covered everything, thick layers of it, untouched for centuries. Our footsteps left the first marks the ground had seen in a very long time. Marcus walked up to one of the golden pillars and tapped it gently with his knuckles. Solid metal. Victor's eyes lit up immediately. "Do you realize what this means?" he said quietly. "This city alone could contain enough artifacts to rewrite entire sections of ancient history." Marcus grinned. "And probably enough gold to buy a few islands." But Elena wasn't looking at the treasure. She was staring down one of the dark streets between the buildings. "Did you see that?" she asked suddenly. We all turned. "See what?" I asked. She hesitated. "I thought something moved." The street ahead was empty, just rows of silent buildings and statues covered in dust. Marcus shrugged. "Probably your imagination." But Jonah had already lifted his flashlight and swept the beam slowly across the alleyways. For a moment, the light caught something strange. Marks in the dust, not ours. Thin lines dragging across the ground, leading deeper into the city. Jonah crouched beside them. "These aren't footprints," he said. Victor leaned closer. "What are they then?" Jonah didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the long curved grooves in the dust. Then he said something very quietly. "These look like something crawling." A strange silence settled over the group. Marcus forced a laugh. "Well, if something's been living down here for centuries, it probably deserves the place." But no one else laughed, because far away, somewhere in the dark streets of that buried city, something made a faint scraping sound. Slow, wet, moving across stone. And for the first time since entering the cavern, I had the terrible feeling that we weren't alone in Atlantis. The sound came again. Soft, a slow scrape, like something heavy dragging itself across stone somewhere deep in the city. Then silence. Marcus turned his flashlight toward the street where the noise had come from. Nothing moved. The beam of light slid across empty doorways, broken statues, and thick layers of dust that had clearly been undisturbed for centuries. Or at least, most of them had. Jonah stood up slowly. "You all heard that," he said. Victor gave a small shrug, though I noticed he was gripping his flashlight tighter than before. "Cave's echo," he said. "Sound travels strangely underground." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. Probably a rock shifting somewhere." But Elena hadn't taken her eyes off the dark street. "It didn't sound like rock," she said quietly. Her voice carried a tone that made the air feel heavier. Calloway finally stepped forward. "We didn't come this far to start imagining things," he said. "Let's focus." He gestured toward the buildings ahead. "Document everything. Structures, inscriptions, artifacts, carefully." And just like that, the work began. For the next hour, we moved slowly through the outer sections of the city. The architecture was unlike anything I had ever seen. Massive circular plazas connected by wide streets, tall towers covered in geometric patterns that looked almost identical to the symbols on the metal plate. And everywhere, gold, not just small decorative pieces, entire doors made from it, columns, statues. Marcus couldn't stop shaking his head. "Either these people had endless resources," he muttered, "or they really wanted to impress someone." Victor, on the other hand, was practically glowing with excitement. "This is the greatest archaeological discovery in modern history," he whispered. "Do you realize that?" Elena walked quietly beside me, sketching symbols whenever we found them. "This writing is everywhere," she said, "but it's still not behaving like a language." "What do you mean?" I asked. She pointed at a long row of markings carved into a wall. "The same symbol repeats constantly, but not in any grammatical structure." "So what is it?" Elena hesitated. "I think it might be instructions." "For what?" Her eyes moved slowly across the dark city around us. "I'm not sure yet." Eventually, we reached what looked like the center of the city, a massive circular courtyard surrounded by tall stone arches. At the very middle stood a structure larger than the others, a temple, or something very much like one. Its entrance was framed by two enormous statues. At first glance, they looked human, but when I stepped closer, I felt a chill crawl along my spine. Their backs were bent forward, their arms too long, and their mouths, those same wide, unnatural shapes we had seen in the cave carvings. Marcus noticed my expression. "Yeah," he muttered. "I noticed that too." Victor walked up the temple steps without hesitation. "If this is the central structure," he said, "there might be records inside." Jonah frowned. "Or something else." Victor gave him an impatient look. "You're not seriously suggesting—" Before he could finish, another sound echoed through the city, this one closer. A wet scraping noise, slow, deliberate. Everyone froze. Marcus slowly turned his flashlight toward a narrow street behind us. The beam moved across the dust-covered ground, across the long, dragging grooves we had seen earlier, and then it reached the end of them. The grooves disappeared beneath a collapsed archway. Something had crawled through there, recently. Jonah took a step back. "That's not old," he said quietly. Victor forced a laugh. "Oh, come on. There's no way anything could live down here. His words echoed faintly off the surrounding buildings, but the city didn't answer. Calloway spoke softly. We stay together. He turned toward the temple entrance. If there are records explaining this place, they'll be inside. The interior of the temple was enormous. Our lights revealed towering pillars stretching toward a ceiling lost in darkness, and along the walls, hundreds of stone tablets, carved with the same strange symbols. Elena moved toward them immediately. Her fingers hovered over the surface of one tablet. These are different, she said. Victor stepped beside her. How? They're arranged in sequences, she explained, like instructions or a history. Calloway leaned closer. Can you translate any of it? Elena studied the carvings for a long moment. Slowly, her expression began to change. At first it was concentration, then confusion, and finally something else, something darker. What is it? I asked. She swallowed. I think this is describing the ritual. Victor raised an eyebrow. What ritual? Elena pointed to a section of symbols. These lines repeat over and over. They describe protection, concealment, something about hiding the city from the outside world. That makes sense, Marcus said. If they were protecting their treasure. Elena didn't respond immediately. Her flashlight moved to the next line, and the next. Her voice became quieter. There's a warning here. What kind of warning? Jonah asked. Elena hesitated. Then she read slowly. The ritual sealed the city and the wealth within it. Her finger moved lower across the tablet. But the price? Her voice faltered slightly. The price was the people themselves. A cold silence filled the temple. Victor frowned. That doesn't make sense. Elena shook her head slowly. The ritual protected them from invaders, from the ocean, from time itself. She pointed to another section of the tablet, but something went wrong. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. How wrong? Elena's flashlight moved across the final lines of symbols. When she spoke again, her voice sounded strained. The ritual changed them. Changed how? I asked. She turned toward us slowly. Over generations, their bodies adapted to the darkness. Her light drifted toward the entrance of the temple, and eventually, the scraping sound echoed again, this time much closer, right outside. Elena whispered the final words. They stopped being human. At that exact moment, something moved in the doorway, not fast, just a slow, shifting shape in the dark, tall, bent forward, and when our lights finally landed on it, we saw the thing watching us from the entrance of the temple. Its skin was pale gray, stretched tight over a thin, crooked frame. Its arms hung far too long, almost touching the ground, and its mouth opened wider than any human face ever could. Rows of uneven teeth glistened in the beam of our flashlights. The creature tilted its head slowly, as if studying us, recognizing us, remembering something. Then it made a sound, a low, wet clicking noise, deep in its throat, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the temple, something answered. For a moment, none of us breathed. The thing in the doorway didn't rush toward us. It didn't growl or leap or make any dramatic movement like the creatures in movies. It simply stood there, watching. Its long arms hung loosely, fingers almost brushing the stone floor. The joints in those fingers bent in strange directions, like they had learned to crawl long before they ever tried to stand. Our lights trembled slightly as we held them on the figure, and the more clearly I saw it, the worse the feeling in my stomach became, because there were still traces of something human in its shape, but only traces. Its skin was colorless, almost translucent, stretched over bones that looked too long for its body. Veins ran dark beneath the surface like tangled threads. The creature's eyes reflected our light with a pale, glassy shine. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with a slow curiosity, as if we were something it hadn't seen in a very long time. Marcus whispered under his breath, "Well, that answers the question." No one laughed. The creature tilted its head again. Its jaw shifted slightly, opening a little wider. That was when I noticed something truly disturbing. The teeth weren't uniform. Some were short and broken, others long and needle-thin, and several looked human, like they had grown in different stages over many years. Victor slowly took a step backward. This isn't possible, he muttered. Elena didn't take her eyes off the creature. Yes, it is, she said quietly. Her voice sounded distant, like someone piecing together a puzzle they wished they had never started. The ritual changed them slowly, she whispered. Generation after generation, adapting to darkness, isolation, hunger. The creature made another low clicking sound, and this time, the answer came from much closer, right outside the temple. Jonah's voice was tight. There's more of them. Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah. He glanced toward the side exits of the temple hall. How many more? The creature in the doorway suddenly crouched lower, its arms bent, long fingers pressing against the floor. And then it moved. Not fast, but smooth. It crawled one step into the temple. The sound of its limbs dragging across stone echoed through the chamber. Marcus raised his flashlight instinctively. Okay, he said slowly. I'm officially done exploring. Victor snapped out of his stunned silence. We should take samples, he insisted. Marcus stared at him like he had lost his mind. Did you just hear yourself? This is proof of an entire evolutionary. The creature suddenly let out a sharp clicking noise. Louder. Aggressive. From the darkness outside the temple, several more sounds answered. Closer now. Many of them. Jonah grabbed Victor by the arm. We're leaving, he said. Now. Calloway finally spoke. His voice was low but firm. Everyone back toward the ramp. Marcus nodded immediately. That's the smartest thing I've heard all day. The creature watched us as we slowly stepped backward. It didn't chase us at first. It just followed, one slow crawling step at a time, like it was herding us or guiding us. The moment we crossed the temple threshold back into the city streets, the full extent of the nightmare revealed itself. Shapes moved in the darkness between the buildings. More of them, many more. Their pale bodies shifted silently through the narrow streets. Some crawled along the ground, others clung to walls or pillars like enormous insects. Their long limbs bent and unfolded in unnatural ways as they moved closer. Marcus whispered something under his breath that I won't repeat. Elena grabbed my sleeve. There are dozens, she said quietly. Jonah shook his head. No, his voice sounded worse than afraid. There are more than that. One of the creatures moved into the beam of my flashlight. It was smaller than the first one. Its back was twisted to one side, forcing it to crawl unevenly across the ground. But its eyes were just as aware, just as curious. It opened its mouth slowly, and that wet clicking sound came again. The response echoed through the city, from every direction. Marcus took a slow step backward. All right, he said. Running time. And that was when everything broke apart. One of the creatures dropped from the roof of a nearby building. It landed between us and the street, leading back to the ramp. Jonah pulled Victor backward, just as another shape rushed from the shadows beside the temple. Marcus swung his equipment pack like a weapon, forcing the creature to recoil for a moment. Move, he shouted. We scattered toward the nearest open path between the buildings. Behind us, the city came alive. The scraping of limbs on stone echoed everywhere. Low clicking sounds filled the air like some twisted language. They were coordinating, hunting. I ran beside Elena, our lights bouncing wildly across the ancient streets. Ahead of us, Marcus and Jonah pushed toward the base of the spiral ramp. Victor stumbled over loose stone and nearly fell before Calloway caught his arm. For a moment it looked like we might actually reach the ramp without being surrounded. Then a shape lunged from a broken archway. Victor screamed. One of the creatures had grabbed his leg. Its long fingers wrapped around his ankle with terrifying strength. Victor kicked wildly, trying to shake it off. Jonah rushed forward and struck the creature with a metal sampling rod. The thing recoiled for a split second, just long enough for Victor to pull free. But when he stood up, blood was already soaking through the torn fabric around his calf. Marcus grabbed him. Move. We reached the base of the ramp and began climbing. The spiral path wound upward along the shaft wall. Behind us, the creatures gathered at the bottom, dozens of pale shapes crawling over the stone streets, watching us climb, waiting. For a moment, none of them followed. They just stared up into the shaft. Victor leaned against the wall, breathing hard. I think they're afraid to leave the city. Marcus wasn't convinced. Or maybe, he said quietly, they're just letting us get tired first. As if answering him, one of the creatures began climbing the ramp, then another and another. Their long limbs gripped the stone easily. They moved much faster than we did. Jonah looked down and swore, "Climb faster." The race up the spiral shaft had begun, and somewhere below us, the city of Atlantis had finally woken up. The climb up the spiral ramp quickly turned into chaos. At first, we tried to move in an organized line, helping Victor limp along despite the deep tear in his leg. But the moment those creatures began climbing after us, every careful plan collapsed. Their limbs were built for this place. Long fingers gripping the grooves carved into the ramp, bodies flattening low to the stone as they crawled upward with terrifying speed. Marcus looked down once and immediately regretted it. "They're gaining," he said. Jonah didn't slow down, then stopped looking. Victor was struggling badly. The wound on his leg was worse than any of us wanted to admit. His steps had become uneven, and every few seconds he stumbled against the wall. Calloway stayed beside him, supporting most of his weight. "You can make it," the old man said quietly. Victor nodded, but his face had gone pale. "I didn't come all this way to leave empty-handed," he muttered. Even now, some part of his mind was still thinking about treasure. Another scraping sound echoed behind us. Closer. Marcus turned his light downward. 3 of the creatures were already halfway up the ramp. Their pale bodies twisted unnaturally as they climbed, their wide mouths opening and closing in those soft clicking sounds. And behind them, more shapes were beginning the ascent. "Faster!" Marcus shouted. We pushed upward, step after step. The spiral seemed longer now than it had during the descent. My lungs burned. The cold air scraped in and out of my chest. Beside me, Elena kept climbing without a word, though I could hear the strain in her breathing. Behind us, Victor suddenly slipped. His foot hit loose dust on the ramp and he fell hard against the wall. Calloway caught him again, but the delay cost us precious seconds. One of the creatures reached the section of ramp just below us. Its head lifted slowly, those pale, reflective eyes locked onto Victor. The thing opened its mouth, and the clicking sound it made this time was different, excited. Marcus reacted instantly. He grabbed a heavy equipment case from his pack and hurled it down the ramp. The metal box struck the creature square in the chest. For a moment, the thing lost its grip and tumbled backward several meters, crashing into 2 others climbing behind it. Marcus didn't wait to see more. "Move!" he barked. We climbed again, higher. The opening at the top of the shaft had grown slightly larger now, a pale circle of distant light, but it still felt impossibly far away. Victor's steps became slower, then slower again. Finally, he stopped completely. "I can't," he gasped. Calloway turned to him. "You have to." Victor shook his head. The sound of the creatures climbing below us had grown much louder now. "I can't run on this leg," he said. His eyes drifted down the ramp. Then something changed in his expression. Not fear, something worse. Desperation. Victor suddenly grabbed the strap of Marcus's equipment pack. "We should take something with us," he insisted hoarsely. Marcus stared at him. "You're joking." "There was gold everywhere down there," Victor said. "Even one artifact." Jonah stepped forward and shoved him back against the wall. "You're going to get us all trapped." Victor pushed Jonah away. "You don't understand what we found." The argument lasted only seconds, but that was enough. A creature reached the curve of the ramp just below Victor. Its long arm shot forward. The fingers wrapped around his injured leg again. Victor screamed. The sound echoed violently up the shaft. Marcus grabbed his arm. Jonah grabbed the other. But the creature's grip was impossibly strong, and more of them were already climbing up behind it. Victor looked down at the pale hand clutching his leg. Then he looked at us. For the first time since the expedition began, the ambition in his eyes disappeared. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The next moment, the creatures dragged him off the ramp. His fingers slipped from Marcus's grip. His body vanished into the darkness below, and the terrible sounds that followed echoed through the shaft long after we started climbing again. No one spoke for several minutes. We just climbed, breathing hard, listening to the scraping sounds below grow louder again as the creatures resumed their pursuit. Marcus finally broke the silence. "We're not stopping again," he said. "No matter what." No one argued. Halfway up the shaft, the creatures were gaining again. Their bodies moved effortlessly along the grooves. Jonah glanced back once. 3 minutes, he muttered. Maybe less. The circle of light at the top had grown larger now. Just a little more, just a little further. But the ramp still wound upward like an endless coil, and the creatures behind us were faster. That was when Marcus slowed slightly. I noticed it first. "You okay?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then he turned and looked down the ramp, at the shapes climbing toward us. Then he looked back at the rope anchor he had placed earlier during the descent. A quiet realization crossed his face. "Keep going," he said. Jonah frowned. "What are you doing?" Marcus unhooked the rope from his belt and looped it around a jagged outcrop in the wall. "Buying you time." Elena stepped forward. "Marcus," he shook his head. "They're faster than us. You know that." His voice remained calm, almost casual. "If I can slow them down here, you four might reach the top." Jonah grabbed his shoulder. "We're not leaving you." Marcus gave him a tired smile. "You don't get a vote." Another creature reached the next turn in the ramp below. Its pale head lifted. Its mouth opened wide. Marcus stepped forward, gripping the rope tightly. "Go," he said quietly. For a second, none of us moved. Then Calloway spoke. "He's right." The old man's voice carried a heavy sadness, but also certainty. "We don't waste this chance." Jonah hesitated, then nodded. "Come on." We began climbing again. As we rounded the next curve of the ramp, I looked back one last time. Marcus stood alone in the shaft, the rope wrapped around his hands. The creatures were almost upon him, and he was smiling, not with fear, but with the strange calm of someone who had already made peace with what was about to happen. Then we climbed out of sight, but even as we moved higher toward the exit, the sounds of the struggle behind us echoed through the spiral shaft. And the worst part was, the creatures were still climbing. We kept climbing. None of us spoke after Marcus stayed behind. There were no words that could make that moment easier, and none of us were brave enough to turn back and watch what happened to him. But even as we climbed higher, the sounds from below told us enough. The scraping of limbs, the sudden snap of the rope tightening, Marcus shouting something that echoed up the stone walls, and then the terrible chorus of clicking sounds as the creatures surged toward him. After that, silence, a heavy, suffocating silence. But the quiet didn't last long, because the creatures were still climbing. Jonah looked down the ramp again a few minutes later. His face tightened immediately. They got past him. None of us asked how. We didn't need to. Victor was gone. Marcus was gone. And now the things that had once been the people of Atlantis were still crawling toward us through the spiral throat of that ancient shaft. Elena climbed beside me, her breathing uneven now. "How far?" she asked. Jonah looked upward. The pale circle of daylight was much larger now. 2 minutes, he said. Maybe less. But the creatures were faster. One of them appeared around the lower curve of the ramp again. Its long body unfolded across the stone like some horrible spider. Its pale face tilted upward, and that wide mouth opened again. The clicking sound echoed through the shaft, and more answers came from below. Calloway stopped suddenly. The old man leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. "Professor?" I said. He lifted a hand. "Just a moment." But even as he said it, I could see the truth. The climb had taken everything out of him. His chest rose and fell with painful effort. Jonah stepped closer. "We don't have time to rest." Calloway nodded slowly. "I know. Another creature reached the next turn of the ramp below us. Its long arms stretched forward, pulling itself upward with terrifying speed. Elena whispered something under her breath. I realized she was praying. Calloway looked up toward the exit, then back down the ramp, then at the three of us. In that moment, I saw the same quiet understanding that Marcus had shown earlier, the same acceptance. He straightened slowly. You two keep climbing, he said. Jonah frowned immediately. No. Calloway gave him a small smile. You're the strongest one left here. If anyone can make sure they reach the surface, it's you. Jonah shook his head. I'm not leaving another person behind. The old professor placed a hand on his shoulder. Yes, he said softly. You are. Elena stepped closer. There has to be another way. Calloway looked at her with a strange gentleness. When I first found that plate 10 years ago, he said quietly, I was the only one who believed it meant something. His eyes moved toward me. Adrian was the one who finished the puzzle. Then he looked back down the ramp where the pale shapes were climbing closer. And now, you two are the ones who must leave this place. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small flare. Jonah's eyes widened. You can't. Calloway lit it before he could finish. The bright red flame flooded the shaft with light. The creatures below recoiled instantly. Their eyes shrank from the sudden brightness. They hissed, low, wet sounds echoing up the stone walls. Calloway stepped toward the edge of the ramp, holding the flare out in front of him. They lived in darkness for centuries, he said calmly. Light will slow them. Elena grabbed his arm. Come with us. But the old man gently pulled away. If I climb any further, he said quietly, they will reach all of us. Jonah's voice broke slightly. Professor, Calloway smiled one last time. You already know what happens next. He raised the burning flare higher and stepped downward toward the creatures. Go, he said. This time, we did, because we understood that staying would only waste the sacrifice he had already chosen to make. We climbed the final stretch of the ramp as fast as our exhausted bodies would allow. Behind us, the flare's red glow flickered against the stone walls. The creatures screeched and hissed as the light pushed them back, and somewhere in that chaos, Calloway's voice echoed once more, calm, steady. Then the sounds disappeared beneath the stone. The top of the shaft finally came. Cold gray daylight poured through the opening like a miracle. Jonah pulled himself over the edge first. Then he reached down and hauled Elena up. I followed seconds later, collapsing onto the cold stone floor of the upper cavern. None of us spoke. We just lay there breathing the cold cave air, alive. We didn't stop moving after that. Jonah led us through the tunnels, through the first chamber, back into the freezing water passage where the dive had begun, and finally, out into the open ocean. The surface air felt unreal when we climbed onto the boat. Bright. Too bright. The ship's crew stared at us in shock. There had been 6 of us when we entered the cave. Now there were only 3. Jonah sat on the deck, staring silently at the water. An hour later, he spoke for the first time. I'm done with caves, he said quietly. We never told the full truth about what we found. The official report described the expedition as a geological survey that ended early due to dangerous conditions. No coordinates were released. No photographs were published. Atlantis remained a legend, and perhaps that's how it should stay. Jonah disappeared from the research world not long after. I heard he moved somewhere inland, far away from the ocean. Elena and I, we stayed in contact. At first because we were the only 2 people who truly understood what had happened down there. But slowly, something else grew between us. Not immediately, not easily, but over time. Sometimes shared nightmares bring people closer. Even now, months later, I still wake up in the middle of the night, because sometimes, in the quiet darkness, I hear something, a faint scraping sound, like long limbs moving slowly across stone. And in my dreams, I see that buried city again, the gold towers, the silent streets, the pale figures watching from the shadows, waiting, hungry. Because the truth is, We didn't destroy Atlantis. We didn't seal it away. We just escaped. And far beneath the ocean, in a city of endless darkness, those creatures are still there, crawling through the ruins of what they once built, listening, waiting for the next explorers brave enough or foolish enough to follow the path down into the spiral. And sometimes, when the ocean is very quiet, I wonder if they still remember the taste of the last ones who visited. Because I know one thing for certain: if Atlantis ever rises again, it won't be the treasure that comes back to the surface. It will be them.